I'm delighted to be with you this morning. As I said at the wedding homily yesterday, I first arrived in this city some 57 years ago. Georgetown had offered me a track scholarship. I was 17 and very lonely. The college was very different in 1960 than today. Coats, ties, rosary at 10:45, lights out at 11, and a graduate student coming by at 11:15 to make sure all the lights were out. I lasted a year, transferred to Gettysburg, from the oldest Catholic college in the country to the oldest Lutheran college in the country. For 40 years, I've been serving St. Paul's Church in Doylestown. When I was a student here at Georgetown, I attended St. Paul's Church on Connecticut Avenue here in the city. I think more Lutheran churches are called St. Paul than any other name. Paul has cast a large shadow on our heritage, certainly on Luther. In today's epistle from Philippians, we see the length and breadth of his shadow. A Jew circumcised on the 8th day, a persecutor of the church. The feast of Stephen is the day after Christmas. How wise of the church fathers that the wood of the manger and the wood of the cross are cut from the same wood. Birth and martyrdom side by side. Paul, his conversion on the Damascus road, what a shadow he has cast. So let me expand on this theme today of shadow. We read Peter, who didn't always get along with Paul. Peter also had a shadow, and it's quite a story we find in the book of Acts, the sick being laid down on mats and beds so that at least Peter's shadow may fall on some of them. We're all familiar with the old rhyme, I have a little shadow that goes in and out with me, and what can be the use of him is more than I can see. Of what use is a shadow, the unsubstantial nothing we cast on the ground on a sunny day? In some parts of the world, a shadow is very significant. In India, a high-caste Brahmin would throw away his food if the shadow of an untouchable and outcast passed over it. On the other hand, when Gandhi was alive, people would maneuver themselves to have his shadow fall on them. Gandhi was frail and didn't have much of a shadow, but what there was of it was precious, and for some it contained what they felt was a spiritual blessing. In New Testament times, people believed a good man carried with him a healing influence, so they pressed in on Peter as close as they could in the hope that his shadow might fall on some of them. While the idea is almost wholly superstitious to us modern folk, it's symbolic of a great truth, and it's this: every one of us casts some kind of shadow that heals or hurts, blesses or blights. The award-winning novelist Richard Ford, who won a Pulitzer, you may recall, for Independence Day, just came out a few months ago with a new memoir about his parents. He says of his father, "To me, he grew more marginal, even less a presence, more a shadow than a weight." In the Gospel, certainly today, those tenants cast a shadow, and it wasn't a very positive one, nor the people to whom Jesus was addressing. I picked up this morning's New York Times, and there on the front page, we read about this killer in Las Vegas and how his shadow was one of meticulous, controlling nature. What a shadow he cast, and we still don't understand it all. I remember when our chocolate lab, Chester, was alive, he was afraid of his shadow, and I would take that little red light and I'd show it, and he'd get all nervous running around. He was wise to be concerned about his shadow, because you and I can no more keep from exerting an influence than we can keep from casting a shadow on a sunny day. So I ask you this morning, as we reflect on Paul and we reflect on our thoughts this morning, how deep is your shadow? First, it seems to me that our influence is almost unconscious. It's a bit like the sunshine itself. Remember a few weeks ago when we were all paying attention to the sun and we were told not to look directly at the sun? Yet the sun was not conscious of going into trees and grass and flowers, and yet it happens every day. There's a bit of the sun in the apple, a part of the moon in a rose. There's a part of the flaming Pleiades in every leaf that grows. It's so important that we cast our shadows on one another. Those who study church growth tell us that if you don't have 7 people at church who know your name and recognize you and will miss you if you're not here, odds are that in a few months you may drift away and become inactive. Winston Churchill once said, "We shape our buildings and our buildings shape us." Last week we saw that new film called Columbus. Nothing to do with this weekend. It was about Columbus, Indiana. A rather depressing film, but it was all about the modern architecture in Columbus, Indiana, and the shadow cast by those modern buildings. We need each other, and the film brought that out. Unconsciously, we cast shadows on each other. As a veteran Sunday school teacher once said, the banana that gets separated from the bunch always gets skinned. We can't go it alone. Last week I was in Charlotte to preach at the memorial service of my home pastor. He was 99, but he was in his 30s when I first met him. I was 12. His influence on my life is hard to measure. So too my high school track coach, Jack Yockers. So too Ernest Campbell, the preaching minister of the Riverside Church. In the 1970s, I would hold 2 parts of a Grundig radio so I could hear him preach every night, a rebroadcast of his sermon. He had a deep and profound influence on my understanding of what a sermon might look like. Rudisill, Yockers, Campbell, I placed their names on our memorial benches back in Doylestown along with my parents because their shadows have deeply influenced my life to this very day. I love the old story of the motorist who was driving down a country road and skidded out of control and wound up in a ditch. Fortunately, a farmer was there with a horse named Duke. The farmer said, "Don't worry, Duke will pull you out." And he hitched up Duke to this man's bumper. And then the farmer yelled, "Come on, Trigger." Duke just stood there. Then the farmer yelled, "Come on and pull Gus." Duke didn't move. Then he said, "Okay, Duke, now you pull." Duke surged forward with a mighty lunge, and like that, the car came out of the mud and was on the pavement and on its way. And the motorist said, "That was great, but why did you call your horse by the wrong name the first 2 times?" The farmer said, "Well, Duke is blind, and if he thought he was the only horse pulling, he wouldn't have moved." You and I, we need other horses in our harness so we can pull together. If you want that in more classical form, go back to John Donne. No man is an island unto himself. And God does things through us we cannot do alone. I believe each of you can have an influence around here in this city, a deeper influence than you can ever imagine. And yes, most of it will be unconscious, and your witness will be the stronger for it. Our influence, our shadow is unconscious, but our shadow is almost immortal. Think of that. Tennyson had Ulysses say, "I'm part of all that I have met." No one said it better than that great Victorian poet Robert Browning. "I have not chanted verse like Homer, no, nor swept strings like Terpenter, no, nor carved and painted men like Phidias and his friend. I'm not great as they are, point by point, but I have entered into sympathy with these who separate, ignored each other's art. Say, is it nothing that I know them all? Call nothing insignificant." Paul showed us how his shadow could change for the good. Put a deed into a life, get an idea going, and you never know where the shadow of it will fall or how far the ripple will reach. Paul's influence on Luther and Luther's commentaries, influence on John Wesley, who knows where the shadow will end? You and I become like what we admire. I believe that hero worship is the clearest indication of character. Tell me who you admire and I'll tell you who you are. We are indeed part of all we've met. When I preach in Maine each summer, I often refer to Harvard as that school south of here where bright students in Maine go when they can't get into Bowdoin. Well, the remark, it brings down the house, so I keep using it. Well, my daughter said to me last year, "Dad, it's been 3 years in a row. I think you should skip that Harvard story." So I tried it in Pennsylvania and it went flat. But up in Maine, they know Joshua Chamberlain, who was the president of Bowdoin. They know the story. Remember Joshua Chamberlain? In the Battle of Gettysburg, Chamberlain delivered to him 120 Union soldiers who previously deserted their commanding officer. Chamberlain had been given permission to shoot any of these mutineers the moment they failed to cooperate. And this is what he said to them. "We're moving out in a few minutes. I'm told I can shoot you if you don't come. You know I won't do that. This regiment was formed last summer in Maine. There were 1,000 of us then. There are less than 300 now. All of us volunteered to fight for the Union. This is a different kind of army. This has not happened much in the history of the world. We are an army out to set men free." And so they did. And the legacy of Joshua Chamberlain, soldier, scholar, theologian, president of a great college, his shadow lives on. When I went back to Georgetown Friday, I looked all around. There were many changes. My room was 3 times bigger. It's now a schoolroom. It used to be so small with bunk beds. It was strange going back. One thing that's still there is the old cemetery in the middle of the campus where all those old Jesuits are buried. When I was there, they were heroes. Everyone thought wonderful of them. Buildings named after them. Healy and Gaston, you name it. But a few months ago, you picked up your Washington Post and the New York Times, and big stories about when the college was having a hard time of it, they bought and sold slaves. And now the president is doing his best to undo that very ominous and terrible shadow of long ago. He's trying his best to undo it with reparations, with allowing the children of those slaves to come to Georgetown and not pay tuition. He's doing his best. He has a shadow today, and all those Jesuits buried in that cemetery in the middle of the campus, they had a shadow too. Our shadow, I tell you, it's almost immortal. I have a little shadow that goes in and out with me, and what can be the use of it is more than I can see. The rhyme has it exactly right. The use of the shadow is more than we can see, infinitely more than we can see. For the most part unconscious, almost immortal. And now let us note still another thing about influence or shadows. The shadow is irrevocable. You can change your business, you can change your address, you can even change your name, but the influence that has gone out from you cannot be changed. I think of a man returning from a turkey hunt at Fort Hays in Kansas. He'd been drinking heavily, the wind was blowing and the grass was dry, and in his drunken recklessness, he set a match to the dry, crisp grass. His friends tried to stop him, but it was too late. The fire swept through the high grass. Streams and roads were no barrier. The fire swept on for days. All through Kansas and Oklahoma, herds and cattle were destroyed or trapped. Thousands were rendered homeless. When the unhappy young man was sober enough to learn what he had done, he was filled with remorse. They say his hair turned white. He almost went out of his mind. But all his remorse could not undo the damage of that one moment. Now, the story may be a bit melodramatic, but it's nonetheless true. Influence and shadows are like that, unconscious, almost immortal and irrevocable. One poet put it this way: boys flying kites haul in their white-winged birds. You can't do that when you're flying words. Careful with fire is good advice, we know. Careful with words is 10 times doubly so. Thoughts unexpressed sometimes fall back dead, but God himself can't kill them once they're said. I believe that there are two shadows that really matter, that are worth as much as life itself. The first is the shadow of God's grace that changed Saul the persecutor into Paul the apostle. The psalmist had this shadow in mind when he wrote, "O God, you are my God, under the shadow of your wings I will rejoice." The primacy of grace, that shadow is what transformed Luther 500 years ago. The other shadow that matters as much as life itself is your shadow, the one Luke had in mind when he wrote, "The sick were carried out into the streets and laid there on beds and stretchers, so that at least the shadow of Peter passing by might fall on some of them."